It doesn't have to be this way. Hey, girl. Down on your luck. You get a podcast, you can still terrorize people. And no, I do not want to be on it.
On what initially seemed like a typical evening for The Daily Show, an unforeseen event unfolded. Jon Stewart, resuming his familiar spot behind the desk, a characteristic wry smile gracing his features, directed a casual glance toward the camera. What followed was an utterance so precise, so acutely targeted, that it immediately ignited a widespread debate. Meghan Markle, he declared, allowing a beat of silence to hang in the air, is essentially a miniature Brigitte Macron, quite adept at keeping her man in line. The studio audience erupted in applause and laughter. In an instant, the prevalent discourse surrounding Meghan Markle underwent a profound alteration. A distinct change was palpable. For those less familiar with Brigitte Macron, she holds the position of France's First Lady. Notably older than her husband, President Emmanuel Macron, she has frequently been portrayed in European media as exerting significant control or displaying public assertiveness. A widely circulated clip exists, often cited, depicting her subtle dismissal of the president's hand during a diplomatic gathering, a fleeting gesture that surprisingly generated extensive headlines across the continent. This very comparison was the one Jon Stewart invoked, and he didn't merely toss it out as an offhand remark. He meticulously crafted an entire segment around it, developing a sharply humorous piece that methodically highlighted what many perceived as vulnerabilities in Meghan's carefully cultivated public persona. This was no random, quickly forgotten piece of celebrity gossip. This was Jon Stewart, a figure broadly recognized as one of the most astute and piercing comedic voices in the history of American television. He is not known for trivial chatter or propagating internet rumors. His reputation is built on dissecting political paradoxes, challenging established power dynamics, and infusing satire with intellectual depth. Therefore, when he chose to focus on Meghan Markle, his critique carried a resonance that criticisms from other sources simply lacked. He wasn't merely lampooning a public figure, he was, in his distinctive manner, delivering a significant commentary, and its message was received clearly and emphatically by a vast audience. The public response was instantaneous. Social media platforms, including what was formerly known as Twitter, were awash with reactions. Memes appeared within minutes. Images juxtaposing Meghan with Brigitte, accompanied by captions like "boss babes" or simply "bossy," proliferated. Others depicted Prince Harry, digitally inserted into that notable Macron footage, awkwardly attempting to grasp Meghan's hand as she motioned him away, almost like a security detail. The shift was unmistakable. For years, Meghan had managed to maintain an intricate equilibrium, navigating between perceived victimhood and declarations of empowerment, straddling the line between royalty and rebel. Stewart's remark, in a single, decisive stroke, destabilized that meticulously constructed equilibrium. Subsequent reports indicated that Meghan Markle was absolutely incensed. Behind closed doors, the Sussex team found themselves in a frantic effort to manage the situation. She reportedly perceived the segment as not only malicious but also sexist, outdated, and profoundly unjust. She felt singled out, perhaps even profoundly misunderstood. However, here lies the critical distinction. The majority of the public did not share this interpretation. They viewed it as a skillfully executed, acutely observed piece of satire. They saw a comedian finally articulating what many had quietly speculated for some time, that perhaps, just perhaps, Meghan's overarching empowerment narrative seemed incongruous. Furthermore, her podcast, Archetypes, humorously rephrased as Confessions of a Female Founder in the source video, certainly didn't bolster her position. This endeavor was intended to showcase Meghan's intellectual prowess, her insights, and her distinctive viewpoint. Instead, for numerous critics, it became a prime example of what they termed her brand's decline. The program was widely perceived as superficial, lacking genuine depth. Its format involved gentle questions, vague affirmations, and a recurring phrase of "thank you for asking" that rarely led to any substantive answers. Stewart, with his characteristic sharp wit, dismantled it. He quipped that it was less about female founders and more about a foundering female. The studio audience roared with laughter. One could almost envision it. Somewhere in Montecito, a public relations assistant likely resigned on the spot. See not. Critical element here wasn't solely the joke itself, but its temporal context. Meghan's public image had been undergoing a gradual erosion for several months. Unfulfilled multi-million-dollar agreements, awkward interviews, and an odd, pervasive sense that her initiatives simply weren't connecting as they once had. was once lauded as the refreshing outsider, the progressive voice challenging the entrenched monarchy. Yet now, that narrative was unmistakably faltering. And Stewart didn't just highlight this faltering, he projected it onto a grand stage, illuminating it for all to see. What amplified the impact of this particular comedic jab was the individual who delivered it. Jon Stewart is not Megyn Kelly or Piers Morgan. He is not affiliated with the conservative media apparatus that has for years been critical of the Sussexes. He stands as a liberal icon, admired by the very demographic Meghan's team had so diligently sought to win over. Feminists, progressives, creatives, figures within the entertainment industry. These were, in many respects, her core supporters. And now they were participating in the laughter. The humor directed at Meghan slapping her husband into place was more than just a clever line. It was a resonant cultural statement. It conveyed notions of control, emasculation, and dominance. Regardless of whether that portrayal holds absolute accuracy, the sheer volume of its resonance speaks volumes about how the public is increasingly viewing the Sussexes. Prince Harry, once the rebellious royal, the spare forging his own path, is now frequently depicted as the individual lagging behind his wife at high-profile events, seemingly carrying her purse, passively assenting to her declarations. Somewhere along the way, the prevailing perception inverted. What was once seen as a noble act of defiance now, for many, feels like carefully orchestrated disorder. In a media landscape captivated by authenticity, or at least its convincing simulation, Meghan's meticulously crafted public image is beginning to appear less inspiring and frankly more taxing. This is what rendered Stewart's joke so impactful. It wasn't wild or conspiratorial. It wasn't even overtly malicious in the manner of a sensationalized tabloid headline. It was simply keenly observed. And in the realm of satire, that is far more devastating. It implied he was tapping into a truth that people already sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that Meghan Markle's public brand, this portrayal of strength, leadership, and compassion, might just be overly constructed. And in America, when satire strikes so precisely, it often marks a turning point, not merely in media, but in the broader culture. It delineates the shift of a public figure from being iconic to becoming ironic. One moment, you embody the voice of change. The next, you become the punchline. Meghan's public relations team will undoubtedly endeavor to reframe this situation. There might be a fresh public appearance, a carefully worded statement released, perhaps even a new charitable endeavor to champion. However, many contend that the damage has been inflicted. People are no longer just scrutinizing her. They are finding amusement at her expense. And in an era defined by memes and immediate online reactions, this is not an easily manageable PR crisis. The profound impact stemmed not merely from the punchline itself. It lay in how impeccably it encapsulated everything that observers had been quietly questioning for years. Meghan's public image had consistently relied on stringent control. Every official statement, every public appearance, every project was infused with layers of meticulous refinement. From the precisely composed family photographs to the organic moments in interviews that somehow still felt like pre-rehearsed monologues, everything conveyed a sense of calculated strategy. However, the more one attempts to control public perception, the more quickly people begin to seek out imperfections. And Stewart didn't just uncover these imperfections, he systematically exposed them with the blunt force of comedy. He specifically targeted Confessions of a Female Founder, that hypothetical podcast. And candidly, that podcast, in its actual iteration as archetypes, hardly bolstered her public standing. Marketed as a celebration of female entrepreneurship and empowerment, it was widely perceived as resembling an excessively priced TED Talk confined to a Whole Foods aisle. Each episode seemed to adhere to a predictable formula: a softly spoken introduction, an abundance of affirmations, and a curious reluctance to engage with genuine realities. At no juncture did the program truly delve into the harsh, unvarnished struggles that authentic founders experience. There was no mention of financial precarity, no sleepless nights, no emotional breakdowns, no hard-won triumphs. Instead, the focus remained on vague narratives of alignment and vision. Critics were not being unkind when they stated it felt inauthentic. They were simply being truthful. Meghan, despite her public persona, had never actually established a company in the conventional sense. There were no first-hand experiences with payroll complexities, no hiring dilemmas, no product launches from the ground up. The only true founding she had undertaken was the establishment of a media brand, inextricably linked to her royal title. And even that, by many accounts, was not performing optimally. Reports indicated that various deals were being discontinued, public engagement was diminishing, and even her Netflix animated project, Pearl, was quietly canceled before it could generate any significant impact. Consequently, when Stewart lightheartedly suggested that the show was less about founders and more about someone foundering, the impact was disproportionately severe. Not because it was brutal, but because it was undeniably accurate. He articulated precisely what everyone was already silently acknowledging, that Meghan's portrayal of struggle was so sanitized, it bordered on a caricature of genuine ambition. And when the joke landed, there wasn't a single gasp from the audience, only laughter. This perhaps represents the most potent form of rejection, not outrage, but profound indifference. Prince Harry, too, faced direct scrutiny. Stewart's barb aimed at him, describing him as the unemployed immigrant who relinquished his family, his home, and now carries his wife's handbag at charity dinners, was not merely cutting, it was precisely surgical. It directly undermined the meticulously cultivated image of a royal rebel that Harry had attempted to construct since stepping away from the monarchy. His tell-all interviews, the high-profile memoir, Spare, the consistent emphasis on finding his voice, all of these efforts clashed starkly with the depiction Stewart offered, an individual perpetually relegated to the periphery of his own narrative. And realistically, this is increasingly the perception forming in public appearances. Harry rarely addresses the audience anymore. Meghan consistently commands the spotlight, delivering the speeches and making the impassioned appeals. Harry stands beside her, often smiling like a formal bodyguard. While this observation may seem harsh, public optics are paramount, especially when one's public image is reliant on visibility. If the public begins to view you as merely an accessory in your partner's journey, public sympathy rapidly dissipates. The irony embedded here is profound. Both Meghan and Harry built their post-royal brand on a foundation of authenticity. They asserted their departure from the palace was due to its stifling nature, its inability to allow them to be genuinely themselves. However, outside those palace walls, their new life began to appear equally, if not more, orchestrated. From the precisely timed paparazzi interactions to the seemingly private home footage in their Netflix documentary series, nothing any longer felt truly spontaneous. And when authenticity starts to feel conspicuously crafted, it inevitably becomes material for comedy. Jon Stewart did not originate the critical sentiment toward Meghan Markle. For many years, critiques of the Sussexes predominantly circulated within conservative media outlets, tabloid columns, or passionate online rants. However, this instance represented a fundamental departure. This was a highly regarded comedian, a figure known for his progressive ideals, openly articulating what a considerable number of people were already contemplating, that perhaps the emperor was, in fact, without clothes, and the audience's response was applause. This signifies more than just a public relations challenge. It marks a notable cultural shift. This was not about her gender, her biracial identity, or her status as an outsider. That is often the defensive argument presented by her supporters. However, Stewart's joke was not targeting those characteristics. It was piercing through them. Through the meticulous branding, through the rehearsed vulnerability, through the repetitive cycle of carefully presented victimhood. He was not mocking her identity. He was, rather, satirizing the manner in which she seemingly utilized it as a shield. The laughter within that studio was not malicious. It was indicative of weariness. Weariness from being implicitly instructed to admire someone who always seemed just beyond genuine connection. Weariness from being presented with empowerment that lacked substantive depth. Weariness from observing authenticity, marketed as a premium product. The joke resonated not because people harbored genuine animosity toward Meghan, but because they no longer felt they truly understood who she was. And here lies the more complex truth. Jon Stewart is a comedian who selects his targets with immense deliberation. He does not pursue fleeting popularity. He does not opportunistically latch onto easy trends for viral content. If he chose to deliver that particular jab, it suggests he believed the public was receptive to hearing it. This is the unspoken truth, the quiet observation no one wants to articulate aloud, that perhaps, just perhaps, the prevailing sentiment has fundamentally altered. Not because people are consumed by animosity towards Meghan, but because they have simply ceased to believe in what she is offering. Meghan's public image has consistently relied on controlling the narrative, to guide the story, sculpt the image, and dominate the conversation. From her significant interview with Oprah to her polished documentaries, she meticulously positioned herself as a voice of modern royalty, boldly assertive, effortlessly graceful, and tragically misunderstood by the established institutions that sought to silence her. However, when satire begins to dictate the discourse, the narrative gradually eludes the individual who once commanded it. This represents the true threat Meghan now confronts, not widespread condemnation, but rather increasing irrelevance. The comparison to Brigitte Macron was not arbitrarily chosen. It was selected for maximum impact. a woman widely regarded as intelligent and elegant, yet frequently critiqued for her perceived dominance in the public sphere and a reserved demeanor behind the scenes. That label, Mini Brigitte Macron, was highly charged. It depicted Meghan as a figure who not only eclipses her husband, but actively molds him into a secondary character within her own unfolding drama. In a different context, the joke might have been dismissed as just another celebrity jab, but originating from Jon Stewart, accompanied by the resounding sound of audience approval, it instantly became a major talking point. Meghan's reaction, described by insiders as furious and humiliated, is precisely what lent the comedic bit its effectiveness. The moment a public figure begins to take themselves overly seriously, comedy inevitably finds its mark. And Meghan, despite her considerable poise and planning, perhaps overlooked the fact that sometimes the most effective way to safeguard one's public image is to allow the humor to land and simply move forward. Instead, she is perceived as becoming increasingly agitated, frantically attempting to salvage a reputation that is no longer entirely within her command. Her team has, predictably, attempted to adjust their strategy. Reports circulate of new initiatives, fresh collaborations, even murmurs of a media resurgence. However, the prevailing sentiment has shifted. Regardless of how meticulously crafted the rollout, the public now interprets every action she takes through the lens of performance. A new podcast? Fabricated. A new charitable endeavor? A public relations maneuver? A seemingly spontaneous moment with her children? Staged. That is the fundamental issue. When your authenticity is met with laughter on a public stage, you no longer receive the benefit of the doubt. And Harry? His public standing has diminished even more rapidly. Once the prince who famously stepped away from the crown to protect his wife, he is now frequently portrayed as a somewhat lost figure trailing behind her, seemingly unable to discover his own voice or direction. His memoir, Spare, was intended to reclaim his personal narrative. Instead, for many, it was perceived as a blend of a therapy session and an excessive tabloid exposé, generating more skepticism than empathy. Stewart's jest about the handbag and the exile was not merely amusing, it was devastating due to its vivid imagery. Everyone could easily visualize it, and once a joke creates a persistent mental image, it becomes incredibly difficult to erase. There is a unique potency in comedy that articulates truth with too much precision. It doesn't invite debate, it compels repetition. On social media, clips from The Daily Show continue to circulate widely. People aren't engaging in arguments about them. They are appending captions, integrating reactions, and creating TikTok videos that amplify the derision even further. Meghan and Harry are no longer merely being criticized by detractors, they are being transformed into memes by former admirers. This particular form of backlash is not loud or boisterous. It is characterized by its coldness. You won't observe angry headlines or widespread boycotts. Instead, what you witness is silence, dwindling viewership figures, and an uninterested public. The very foundation upon which Meghan constructed her brand, attention, is now slipping away. And that outcome is more detrimental than outright animosity. Hostility keeps your name in the news. Indifference, however, pushes you out of it entirely. Hollywood has taken note. Media executives who once eagerly pursued lucrative contracts are now quietly withdrawing. Podcast agreements are reportedly concluding prematurely. Public interest is waning, not because Meghan committed an unforgivable act, but because she ceased to be truly engaging. When every utterance sounds rehearsed, every smile appears timed, and every project feels like a public relations maneuver, the audience does not become enraged, they become bored. There was a period when Meghan symbolized something larger than herself. She was a biracial woman who dared to challenge an institution centuries old. She transitioned from an American actress to a duchess, then to an activist. She was envisioned as the embodiment of a new kind of monarchy, one that championed progress and transformation. But now, divested of that mystique and supported by content that many find underwhelming, she is merely another celebrity striving to maintain relevance in a media landscape that moves too rapidly to genuinely care. Jon Stewart did not directly dismantle Meghan Markle's public standing. He didn't need to. He simply ignited the fuse. The genuine explosion originated from the existing cultural atmosphere surrounding her, a powerful confluence of public weariness, unmet expectations, and years of meticulously crafted public performances finally fracturing under scrutiny. The laughter was not solely about the joke itself. It was about the profound sense of release, the collective sigh from an audience that was finally done with pretending they couldn't discern the underlying manipulations. And now, Meghan confronts perhaps the most formidable challenge in the media sphere: re-engaging public interest. Not eliciting sympathy, not provoking outrage, but simply capturing genuine attention. The difficulty lies in the fact that she cannot employ the same strategies as before. The victim card, for many, has lost its efficacy. The feminist branding feels superficial. The fairy tale narrative has faded. If she truly desires to regain credibility, she will need to dismantle everything. Abandon the elaborate branding. Display genuine struggle, authentic success, something truly unscripted. However, such a fundamental shift is exceptionally difficult for someone who has dedicated years to perfecting a meticulously controlled narrative. And in a world where satire operates with greater speed than sincerity, she may not be afforded the necessary time to even attempt it. Because when Jon Stewart renders you the focal point of a joke, it transcends mere humor. It becomes a cultural judgment.